In a cosmic war between order and chaos, a race of giants threatens to invade the abode of the gods, and the gods ultimately recruit a mortal hero to stop them. This is the Gigantomachy, or the War of the Giants, a foundational Greek myth. You can find it running through classic works like Hesiod's Theogony and Ovid's Metamorphoses. But the story I just told you comes from a place you might not expect, the Bible. This is not a religious channel, but it's not a religious channel. Sadly, there's not as much overlap of biblical and classical studies as there really should be. Both the Old and New Testament are overflowing with similarities to the old gods and heroes. In its first centuries, Christian apologists appealed to both Jews and pagans with similar acknowledgement, but with the decline of Hellenism, they stopped doing that, mostly abandoning the Greek classics until the Renaissance. When Hellenism disappeared, the church focused on anti-Judaism. While the church has lost a lot of knowledge from diminishing Jewish interfaith dialogue, the result of the void of pagan influence has been near total amnesia. For churchgoers outside of the academic loop, they're less familiar with the intricacies of the Jewish religion, but almost entirely unaware of Greek mythology at all. It's like a Marvel Comics fan having a casual awareness of DC Comics and at most a name recognition of Fawcett Comics characters. Even today, when you refer Christians to Greek sources, they may have a superstitious aversion to non-Christian religious materials. But I'm going to argue that you can't really understand the Bible without it. As it appears in the biblical narrative, the War of the Giants is broken up and integrated into other narratives. Readers may be familiar with the antediluvian giants, the Nephilim, and Goliath, the giant killed by David, but giants appear throughout the Bible in between those two. I'm going to extract the biblical Gigantomachy and show how it arrived in its present form. This process will also demonstrate that the Hebrew version is based on the Greek and not the other way around. This in turn will suggest that the composition of the Hebrew narrative was much later than has been commonly understood. But that also helps explain things like why the first 11 chapters of Genesis aren't referenced elsewhere, and why the Eden mentioned in the exilic prophet Ezekiel bears no resemblance to the story of Adam and Eve. Contrary to the popular visual image within the Torah in the form of a revelation carved onto stone tablets, I'm going to show how the text was more malleable and fragile. Think of it instead as tectonic plates colliding with each other, crumbling and sorting layers out of order. I see the Hebrew redactors as literary hoarders who couldn't toss anything out. They include all available materials, even rough draft, duplicate, and incomplete stories. That's how we end up with 3 sister-wife narratives. Like Ovid assembling the Metamorphoses chronologically, they had a collection of diverse stories to put in order, but they didn't always know the right place to put them. Some things don't really seem to fit anywhere. Inserting a story in the wrong place would break something someplace else, and if they tried to fix that, then it broke something else. The biggest textual disruptor was the flood, but other stress points are apparent in the character of Joshua and the 40 years of wandering. I identify evidence of disruption when we notice discrepancies or where stories become unclear or unintelligible. Even when the story flows coherently, I observe whether commentators in antiquity, like Philo and Josephus, felt it necessary to add details. I also examine if a narrative's continuity still flows logically without a suspected element present. I just want to clarify a few things first. I'm extracting the text for simplification purposes. In places where I suggest the text is out of order, I am not reliant on reordering the text to support my conclusions. The text is still what it is in its final form, and still has the meaning its author intended in that arrangement. This also isn't intended to discredit or replace existing source theories, although that's outside the scope of this topic. I'm trying not to step on anybody's toes if this has already been done before. This is my own analysis of primary sources, and while I tried to find academic materials on the subject, I was unable to. So any similarities to anybody else's work based on the same sources is entirely coincidental. The catalyst that sets off the Greek Gigantomachy is the castration of Uranus by his Titan son Cronus. From his spilled blood, the earth goddess Gaia brought forth the giants, and after a war of the Titans, the giants rose up to challenge Zeus and the Olympian deities. In the biblical version, the earth-born Nephilim emerge when the sons of God have children with the daughters of humans. But this story is abruptly interrupted by the flood narrative, which presumably killed all the humans and the Nephilim, but at the same time doesn't. From the very start, we see how far God will go to defeat the giants. It should be noted that the Greek giants are buried under volcanoes in their defeat, not by a flood. Remember that for later. If we skip over the flood to the Tower of Babel, we see men trying to build a tower to the heavens, similar to what the giants try to do by piling mountains upon mountains in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and also mentioned in Plato's Symposium. In the Bible story, the scheme is foiled when God confuses their languages. Still no volcanoes or fire and brimstone. But God has also promised not to flood the earth again, so we won't see that device repeated in this book. In Genesis 18 and 19, there's a theophany with parallels to the story of Baucis and Philemon in Ovid's Metamorphoses. That story will be repeated several more times, so I'll be doing another separate video just for that. However, the important detail to notice here is that the destruction in the climax of the Baucis and Philemon story is actually a flood. The biblical writers have signaled they aren't going to use a flood as a plot device again, and instead, burning sulfur rains down on Sodom and Gomorrah, like a volcano. So although it's displaced, this appears to be the proper finale to the Gigantomachy cycle, and the epilogue logically follows from that perspective. Following the ruin of Sodom, there's a survivor epilogue resembling the one after the flood, where Noah gets drunk and naked and has an unclear incident with his son Ham. The survivor epilogue makes less sense in this position in the context of Sodom and Gomorrah, but the story itself makes more sense. Lot's daughters act like they're the last people on earth and get their own father drunk to have children. But it makes sense as part of a gigantomachy, similar to the incestuous relationship between Gaia and Uranus, and their offspring, the Moabites and the Ammonites, will be later associated with giants. There's an obscure narrative in Exodus 4 that I speculate could have been part of the gigantomachy. At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met him and was about to kill him, but Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. "Surely you are a bridegroom of blood to me," she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time she said bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. The unspecified pronouns make it hard to tell what's really going on in this story. A flint knife does sound suspiciously similar to the flint tool that Cronus uses to castrate his father. Was this originally a castration narrative? A possible strike against that theory is that the Septuagint reads a stone rather than a knife. However, that wouldn't be the only occurrence in this gigantomachy in which the Hebrew text is closer to Greek myth than the Greek text. The story of David and Goliath has an extended sequence in the Hebrew text that's absent from the Septuagint, yet the Hebrew portion is also a remarkable parallel to the Iliad. On the other hand, this could have been a duplicate etiology for the circumcision covenant, complete with an attempted child sacrifice like Isaac. Moses is credited with introducing circumcision in some Hellenic sources, but because the writers had to use that plot point for Abraham, they couldn't reuse it in full here, so this may just be all that remains of it. The text seems to be trying really hard to insist this is just circumcision and not something else. It reads like something is missing, but unfortunately, there's not enough left of it to draw any definite conclusions. After the Exodus, the Israelites scout out the Promised Land and their spies encounter the Nephilim for the last time in the Bible, but that won't be the last time we see the giants. The denotation of the Nephilim gets transferred to the Anakites and then from there to the Rephaites. Throughout the Septuagint, this term gets rendered as gigantes, or giants. In Greek, this didn't necessarily mean great in size, and up until this point there's been no indication of enormity. But here, the Israelites relatively compare themselves as grasshoppers to the giants, and from this point on, the giants will be associated with size. Og of Bashan is killed in his first and only appearance, but the retelling of this story in Deuteronomy includes the memorable detail of his giant-sized iron bed. He's mostly unknown today, even though he's mentioned more often than other characters who were never heard of again outside of one story. One reason why I'm so confident the composition of the Heptateuch must have come after exposure to Greek influence is that while the giants are all over the epic narrative, they seem to be unknown to all the prophets. Og is an outlier that seems to have had an older tradition. His name appears in the Psalms, which I would describe as a backup file for the Hebrew folklore. He seems to have been talked about more in antiquity, and there's an extra-biblical tradition that he was a survivor of the flood. The story of Samson has numerous parallels to Hercules, the mortal champion of the Greek myth. Although they're not enumerated like Hercules, Samson performs a total of 12 labors, and both of them end up having to make up a failed one. Samson slays a lion like his Greek counterpart, but there's not much material here that directly contributes to the Gigantomachy. Perhaps carrying the gates of Gaza away from the city could be seen as similar to defeating a giant by carrying it away from his homeland. By this time in the narrative, Gaza and the Philistines are loosely associated with the Rephaites, but there are no definite parallels. I include it here as a mention, but the story of Samson is probably more similar to stories about Hercules that exist apart from the Gigantomachy. David's narrative doesn't have all the similarities to Hercules, but like Samson, he does slay a lion. David famously slays the most fearful Philistine giant of all, Goliath. We get a few more additions to the mythology, like the detail that the giants have extra fingers, but after this, the giants vanish from the narrative. Just like in its Greek counterparts, the Gigantomachy was a through line that ran through the Hebrew national epic. It's not a central theme or connective tissue, but rather a subplot in the background that you may not even notice if you're not looking for it. The Gigantomachy is intertwined with the theophany that periodically recurs in cycles throughout the text, and both combine as a justification for the destruction of the Canaanites.